Welcome to First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the birthplace of congregational humanism. We carry on that tradition of free thought today, dedicated to promoting a free search for truth, meaning, and justice. Our web address is firstunitarian.org. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for having me. It's great to be among Unitarian humanists. As a Unitarian Universalist secular humanist, I feel like I live in the middle of the world's most beautiful Venn diagram. Vice President Vance says that agnostics and atheists can't have a value system, but joke's on him because I have like 2.5. Sorry, Mr. Vice President, there was a 2-for-1 sale at the Heresy store. As the executive director of the American Humanist Association for about the past 6 months or so, I find myself often in both the thrilling and the challenging position of having to represent humanists and what we believe. And I say challenging because the beliefs of a group that prides itself on free thinking are not easily synthesized and summarized. There's the old joke, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And our version of that is 2 humanists, 4.5 opinions, and an epistemological debate on the nature of belief. I've tried saying, if you believe in the golden rule but don't believe in God, you're a humanist. That we believe that what makes people special and important and worth fighting for is not an immortal soul or an intelligently designed body, but consciousness. Our capability to think independently, to imagine better futures for ourselves and fellow humans, to build lives of meaning and purpose from the infinite canvas of a free mind. That we believe in people, in human goodness, in human dignity, in human potential, that we believe there's no problem people can't solve and no truth we can't uncover as long as we live in societies that protect the right to think freely, and that this, our capacity to evolve from fish and build civilizations, is all the miraculousness that we need. That the difference perhaps between humanism and atheism is that atheism's primary critique of establishment Christianity is about the existence of God, and that humanism's primary critique of establishment Christianity is about the existence of original sin, the notion of broken people needing to be saved or redeemed, rather than being valuable exactly as they are. So I talk a lot about what humanists think, but I also believe humanism is a practice, and that means lately I've been thinking a good deal about ritual. Because I believe people curious about humanism would rather hear what humanism calls us to do rather than what humanists think. They say faith without works is dead and faithlessness without works is just arguing on Twitter. If the Catholics have communion and the Muslims have pilgrimages and the Jews have bar and bat mitzvahs, what is it that we do that makes us humanist, that breathes humanism into the world? I've been reading an amazing book lately by Greg Epstein, the humanist chaplain at Harvard and MIT, and he quotes in the book the religious historian Jonathan Z. Smith, who talked about religious ritual as, quote, a means of performing the way things ought to be in conscious tension with the way things are. Performing the way things ought to be in conscious tension with the way they are. In an unjust and isolated world, there are a hell of a lot of things we could perform differently. And that's the great thing about humanism. We've always been a movement of people unimagined or unafraid to imagine better. Unwilling to be hemmed in by the present, by reality, sure, but always venturing to the edge of the possible. I grew up humanist. A lot of folks in the humanist community are familiar with me through my dad, Pete Stark, who was an open humanist and the first open atheist to serve in Congress. And it was through those values that I learned in my family that I ended up embarking on a career in what I call applied humanism, which others might call education. I did my academic tours of duty at Yale and Harvard studying child psychology, but specifically the work of the humanistic psychologists. and how we come to develop our moral and ethical beliefs, and how those beliefs give us a sense of purpose and well-being. As Vonnegut says, we are only healthy to the extent that our ideas are humane. And I've spent my career since then asking the question, how do we build solutions to help people feel like they belong and that they matter? So I've spent the last decade, as Reverend Uland said, building bullying prevention programs and school climate programs that have helped kids feel safe in school, and service learning programs that give young people a sense of belonging and meaning in their community, a secular version of the Boy and Girl Scouts, where kids who didn't feel at home anywhere else found a group that welcomed them in. Because we talk a lot in the world of education and human capital about unleashing potential, about a world where everyone is equipped to be their best self. And we often talk about it as a function of skills and attitudes, that if we just teach people the right ways to do things, they'll flourish. But what we know, what the humanistic psychologists from Dewey to Maslow have taught us, is that we only reach true wellness and true flourishing and true potential when we feel connected to others, when we feel a sense of meaning and purpose and value in our community. That's the building block. I wonder sometimes if this is the practice of humanism, the recognition of the right of all people to matter and belong as an extension of their inherent value, and the active choice to welcome and include, to help others see the humanity in themselves and the common humanity between all of us. I think about the feeling of falling in love. My fiance is an agnostic Jew, and I'm a Unitarian secular humanist, which is what we call an interfaithless marriage. She has enthusiastically embraced Unitarianism, although she hates the word church, and still sometimes calls us the island of misfit goys. And I remember the feeling, and I imagine many of you remember the feeling too, when I met her, of finally feeling known. And the wave of relief and joy that rushes over you when you realize here, in an alienated and broken world, is someone who understands, someone who sees the whole of me and opens their arms even wider. It reminds me of how I felt when I learned there was a word for what I believed, that I was a humanist, and that in being so, I was connected to millions of incredible people like me, from people my age to people in this room to historical heroes like Twain and Frederick Douglass and Eleanor Roosevelt. I hope you'll take a moment to imagine how that felt for you, that realization that you weren't the only one. We often talk, it's my job to be in a lot of conversations where I talk and have to have answers about growing humanism. But we don't often talk about why it matters to popularize humanism, to share it and invite more people in, because it's not enough that we're right. That's not sufficient motivation, I think, to do the hard and vulnerable work of welcoming strangers. We often talk about the worthiness and the correctness of our cause more than the benefits of common belief and identity that people searching for something to belong to and believe in can be offered. The truth is that I think people need humanism more than humanism needs people. Because there are tens of millions of Americans, and we know this, there's survey data that makes it very clear, who are both broadly secular and broadly progressive, who believe, as we do, in human dignity and goodness and potential, that rationalism is the source of empirical truth and empathy is the source of moral truth. And many of those tens of millions of Americans feel dispossessed in a world where our voices are diluted by racist political structures and money in politics, where our paycheck doesn't go far enough, where in places like Minneapolis or Annapolis, where I live, the people who grew up there can't afford to buy the homes that they grew up in. Feeling alienated from their peers, distant from a purpose, unsure of their value outside of their achievements and earning potential, feeling disillusioned with the systems and movements they trusted to protect them. We've seen the statistics. Social isolation affects a third of Americans. Rates of anxiety and depression are spiking, and they have been since roughly 2012. The driving cause of mental health issues among young people are a lack of purpose and direction. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who we suspect is a humanist, has called loneliness an epidemic. Vonnegut says that the most daring thing to do is to create stable communities in which the disease of loneliness can be cured. And if it's a disease, the antidotes are known. We know from the research of Dr. Kristen Neff at UT Austin about the power of common humanity, as she calls it, to create well-being. That simply knowing that there are things that connect you to other people, that you are not alone in your ideas and experiences, helps you feel valued and worthy. We know from Carl Rogers, one of the forefathers of humanistic psychology, that one of the most important things for someone's confidence is a stable self-concept, a set of core beliefs and community that you feel connected to, a greater why that allows us to experience the thrill and agency of acting with self-integrity, living lives in line with our beliefs and our community. We have to know what those things are first. In other words, there are tens of millions of untapped humanists who are struggling because they don't know where they belong, what they believe, where they're welcome. Then this is not just an opportunity to grow the humanist movement, but an opportunity to heal some of the deep brokenness in America, which feels like a tinderbox of alienation, a place where people increasingly feel their value to others is conditional and are putting up defenses accordingly. As humanists, we're pragmatic, we're materialist, so it occurs to me that I've gone on about as long as I should in talking about why we have an incredible opportunity and obligation to welcome new people in and talk a little more about how. To go back to Jonathan Smith's idea of ritual, what can we do to perform the way things ought to be, a world where people belong and are valued in conscious tension to the way things are? What could we do to make humanism feel like the opposite of loneliness? To extend that act of love, which I understand we're centering lately as Unitarians, of welcoming people into a common identity. One thing is to recognize that people feel valued and curious when they see people fighting for them. And as humanists, we're no strangers to political action, especially in times like these, where the values that we care about are being threatened. We are the movement of revolutionaries like Gloria Steinem and Thomas Paine and Jamie Raskin and Emma Goldman, who once brilliantly said, "We have only as much liberty as we have the intelligence to want and the courage to take." We have to publicly connect our social and political action to our humanist beliefs, and rather than treating those beliefs as self-evident, to explain the humanist principles and the reasoning that underlie our passion, so that people don't just understand what humanists think, but why they think it, that can build mental models for themselves of what it means to think humanistically. Humanists love talking, but we do a lot of our talking to each other. And I'm convinced that this is a time for us to embrace every tool at our disposal, to talk broadly about humanism, not with the intent of convincing people who disagree with us, but reminding the people who already agree with us that they have a home, to give people the gift of an identity, what we've all experienced, of feeling for the first time that there is a word for what you believe, that our counterculture of reason and empathy in an unreasonable and uncaring world connects us to millions of strangers through bonds of shared beliefs and shared respect. To do that, we're going to have to do more to talk to people, not on our terms, but on theirs. We have to resist the temptation and the sugar high of using our favorite proprietary terms and talk about people's aspirations and values and wounds in their language. In particular, we need to do much more to talk about what we do believe, I'm convinced, than what we don't believe, especially because of the 30% of Americans who are secular. Half are agnostic, not driven by a belief in the supernatural, but not comfortable committing to non-belief as a first principle. When I was working in the tech startup world, we were building apps to help children build positive mental health before they entered middle school, where now over 50% of kids experience some form of anxiety or depression in their teen years. We were building an app like Duolingo that children and their parents could use together every night to help build the basic skills of mental wellness and resilience. And we weren't getting very far. We especially, frankly, weren't getting very far because we were struggling to attract customers who were of color from immigrant communities. And we realized that part of the problem was the language we were using. We were talking about the term that I had been taught for this work at Harvard and Yale, which was social emotional learning. And we were realizing that that language felt distinctly academic and disconnected from the aspirations that people, and especially people of communities of color, had for their children. It wasn't that they disagreed with what we were offering, but when we tried to explain it to them, we sounded like a foreign agent. And, so we did the work of not just sitting in people with conversation, but gathering the data about how people, when they were asked to talk about it themselves, framed what they wanted and hoped for their children. And we realized that people talked about this sense of wellness and resilience, not using words like, emotional wellness or social emotional learning, but confidence. When we started using the word confidence, we saw an incredible growth and excitement about what we were offering. It reminded me of the power of stepping out of the comfort of language that is familiar into the transcendence of language that truly connects. That this too, understanding the language people use to talk about shared values, even if it's not the language we recognize, is an act of recognizing humanity. Quinta Brunson, the humanist and creator of my favorite TV show, Abbott Elementary, which I encourage y'all to watch on Hulu, says, everyday people just trying their best is so moving to me. It makes me emotional when someone gets themselves out of bed and goes to work and makes a difference for a person who is having a hard day or just waves at a person. These are moments to me that are godlike. We need to be comfortable claiming everyday excellence and altruism as acts of humanism, pointing out to people that humanism is something they've already been doing rather than a hurdle that they have to clear. Perhaps they've been doing it all of their life. People are thinking and living humanistically without knowing it every day. Imagine being the person to point it out to them, to point out that people's everyday acts of kindness and justice, their simple embrace of reason and compassion, connects us to a living tradition of some of our nation's greatest thinkers and artists and leaders, an act of taking up the torch lit by people from Thomas Paine to Bill Nye the Science Guy. If there's one thing that I'm convinced of lately, it's that people need to see themselves. Everybody needs to see themselves as a hero in the American story. And if there's one thing we believe as humanists, it's the capacity and the need for everyday heroes. That because we know that no one is coming to save us, and yet we're still here, that we have everything it takes to save ourselves. That if we embrace our agency and honor our ethical obligations, that everyone has the worthiness and the wherewithal within them to change the world. The work of curing loneliness, as Vonnegut says, is hard and vulnerable and disciplined work. Welcoming others means, to a degree, accepting tension between their uniqueness and ours. It means a loss of control. But it starts, I'm convinced, simply with everyday acts of recognizing the humanity of others and letting people who are sitting in the joy of understanding know that that's humanism. Thank you all for having me here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.